I want to post an interview I did a few months back. Now, I have been saving this one because it is so good. There are so many nuggets of information for leaders to soak in here. And I feel like now is really the perfect time to post an interview like this because it is so relevant today, given the fact that leaders around the world are looking at their best laid plans for 2021 and rethinking what success means to them this year. So here it is, an interview with the one and only Doug Holladay, author of Rethinking Success, 8 Essential Practices for Finding Meaning in Work and Life. Now, I met Doug years ago at Georgetown, and I was at the doing the evening MBA program there, and he was piloting an immersive class that truly changed my life. A class that taught me most of all that we all live such integrated lives, and our life's work has to offer more than just a paycheck or happiness. It has to bring meaning. And now this was a course where Doug brought in some of his friends to meet us and talk about how they saw business today and reflecting back on their legacies, what lessons they had learned over the years. And by friends, we're talking about business giants like Stephen Gene Case, Ted Leonsis, Tim Shriver, so many more. Doug's career has been unique and varied. He's advised several presidents and numerous corporate leaders. He's been a senior officer at Goldman Sachs. He's co-founded 2 private equity funds, and he's held senior positions in both the White House and the Department of State. He was even appointed by a president to the personal rank of Special Ambassador, charged with coordinating multiple aspects of the U.S. public response to challenges in South Africa prior to the release of Nelson Mandela. Now, today, Doug's main focus is a nonprofit called Path North, which is a DC-based organization giving business owners and CEOs the space to really have conversations on finding meaning in their work and life. I can't recommend Doug's book enough. It's called Rethinking Success, and you can get it on Amazon or anywhere else where you buy your books. Now, let's dive in to that interview now. I can't wait for you to see it. So, Doug, let's kick this off. Tell me about your new book.
I never thought I'd write a book because I felt like the world didn't need another book. But my good friend Steve Kay said, "You've had the most interesting life and all these stories. You've got 3 boys. Wouldn't you like to capture some of this?" So I wrote it. He said, "Why don't you just write it with them in mind, not with any big idea of a book?" So I did that, and it just seemed like lightning struck. I didn't work hard at getting a deal, but I got a deal with a good publisher, and so I was grateful for that. But having said that, I'm really glad I've done it because, as you know, the title is called Rethinking Success.
No, and I know that you had a problem with the title at first.
Yeah, I did.
Tell me how it got to that.
Yeah, I didn't like it because it seemed like too generic and boring. You know, as you remember from the class, the MBA class, I centered the class around 10 questions you have to ask to have a life, as Aristotle called it, of thriving. Well, they wanted me to say, no, not questions. You got to have more definitive. So they wanted practices. And I wanted it to be a cooler title like Reimagining Success. They said Rethinking Success, 8 Essential Practices for Finding Meaning in Life and Business and Work. And, but having said that, now that we're at a point there where everyone is literally rethinking everything, I think it's a great book. So I've had a lot of chances to go before clients of big financial institutions and things who are all kind of shocked. You know, I call it the myth of uncertainty has been unmasked, and people are realizing how little control they have of anything. And so I think my book tries to say, okay, let's assume all the things you thought, finances, your hope for your kids, your securities, your relationships. Let's assume all of that's in a free fall. What can you know for certain? And that's what I try to unpack in the book, the things that are really a part of the permanent framework of our lives that bring real meaning.
Okay, so I know that you have had so many varied experiences in your life. Everything from working on, in finance to working at the White House to everything in between. Tell me about sort of your path and how you got to the place where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Uh, in my book, the whole first chapter, in fact, I was talking to Warren Buffett's son today, Peter, because he gave me this idea once of the thought. He said, Doug, we're all born into someone else's story. And he talked about being born into this. He didn't ask to be Warren Buffett's son, but he said, here I am at Stanford, matron in finance. I hate it. I don't want to be here. And he said, and then my father famously announced he wasn't leaving us anything. That was not a great day. And then, but then his mother called a few months later and said, your grandfather died, left you $92,000. That day, he packed his car, started driving in New York City to pursue a life in music. And that's what he's done. So for me, my story was interesting. I've done a lot of different things, but if I look at the themes, one theme was I had a father, very inquisitive, who grew up in a small town in Mississippi. His mother was very religious, would go to the local church. He went a couple times and asked questions. They weren't crazy about that, so he stopped going. So I basically grew up in an atheist family because my father didn't have a place where he could have the most important conversations in an honest, candid way. So I realized, Sarah, for me, my whole life trajectory and kind of a sub-theme has been trying to create safe spaces, whether it's been at Goldman Sachs, State Department, White House, Georgetown, wherever it is, safe places for people to truly explore the most important things in life that we're all thinking about, but we don't have places to do this. We're all alone in our thoughts about, how do I have meaning? What does it mean to have a friend? I'm lonely. I'm all these things. So the book really tries to capture the fact that we're all more alike than we're different. And our point of identity with each other is not how strong we are and how successful, but the very weaknesses we're ashamed of or afraid of.
In your book, you discuss finding your way and really learning how to stand on principle. You tell a story about a moment in college where you had to make a choice. Tell us about that.
I asked my MBA class this question sometime. I said, how many of you recall a time where you had to take a stand in some way, little or big, but it was like a test for you to say, who am I? Am I going to do that? Because my theory with high achievers is they always want optionality. They never want to close down any option. So they don't take a hard stance. And you see this in Congress today. Why aren't people, when it's so obvious about certain wrongdoing, but they don't speak up? They just want optionality. So my thought is, how it came to me was I was a freshman in college, and I was a typical achiever, but I kind of, the same type of person. I hadn't taken a lot of stands, but I decided to pledge a fraternity, and they had this thing called Hell Night. They had 20 people, 20 pledges. They tried to get us to say and do all these crazy things, and at some point, I said, if I have to change fundamentally who I am, this is probably not the right fit for me. They're all drunk. This is 4 a.m. And I left. Felt totally, absolutely humiliated. And I thought about this, and I went with my best friend, and we went back and kind of thought of what Homer Simpson said. He said, this is the worst day of your life. It's only the worst day so far. But it was a pretty bad day. And I was thinking about either transferring schools or joining the witness protection program because I felt totally humiliated. But about 4:30 in the morning, I got a knock on my dorm door, and he and I were sitting there. And it was the president of fraternity. He asked me to come outside. And all 60 brothers were standing there, and they said, we crossed the line, and we apologize. You're exactly the kind of person that we want in this fraternity. Well, frankly, Sarah, I'm 18. I wish I could say there were other times in my life where I stood up for things or said the right thing. But this is the first time I ever recall where it could have cost me something. And it turned out pretty good, but it could have gone the other way too, where I was kind of ridiculed and laughing stock for trying to be a little too, I don't know, goody two shoes or something.
So, Doug, you have been close to many well-known leaders over the course of your career. Tell us a little bit about what makes leaders most effective. What are the commonalities between them?
I think up until this recent president, people would have said a big important issue is integrity and character. And because it's funny, when you look at the life of Winston Churchill, can you imagine, against all odds, the mighty Nazi regime that had taken down every country in Europe, and this little tiny island is standing against them? What would make Churchill believable to the British people that we are going to prevail? It's because he had done numerous little things where they trusted him. So when the big things came, they trusted him. This is what leadership is. When you do the little things right and you're trusted and appreciated for that, when the big testing points come, they're going to believe you. And even though nothing they're seeing, would suggest that we're going to get through this. And I think part of the problem we have today with all these interrelated, complicated issues, the pandemic, the financial meltdown, and then most recently what we're seeing in our cities, we just don't have believable leadership where people can say, I want to trust you, whether it's on the health thing. You take that, for example, the White House violates its own guidance. So who are you to believe? And other countries are opening up, and we're starting to close down again because everybody's on their own. And this is what leadership's about. So I'd say, what are people looking for in leadership, to get back to your point? They don't want perfect people. They want authentic people. People that are real with them, shoot straight with them, don't play games, don't play politics. When it comes to crunch time, you just gotta flat do the right thing. And I think that's what we're longing for today. At least I am.
So, who are your mentors, and what's the best advice that you've received from them?
I've had a lot of them. A federal judge named Martin Bostetter was great. Bob Rubin at Goldman Sachs. A couple Goldman Sachs people, Gene Fife, Jeff Boise, head of investment banking. A guy named Chuck Reinhold, who I met when I was 17. He was a great mentor to me. A guy named Doug Coe, who introduced me to people of principle in politics. I've had a lot of great people who have invested in my life, and I've sought it out. My worry for a lot of younger people today is I feel like people aren't investing in them the way they did with me. And part of it is, I think people don't stay with companies that long or enterprises. They hop around so if I'm you're working for me and I'm thinking about investing in you, I'm thinking, well, you'll probably be gone in 2 years. Why would I make my competition better? So I think there's both a hunger and paucity of mentors today. And to me, it's sad. I have 3 boys. I wish they had mentors, but I just don't think people are thinking the same way.
Even when all the companies today, they have all these formal mentoring programs and things like that.
Yeah, I think the formal ones, and they're fine. They're a lot of times skill-based and all that. I think what you really want is somebody that's really a holistic member, mentor wwho gives you feedback on your life, how you're coming across, and all these kind of issues that, the EQ is much more important than the technical thing. And if you just have people that are helping you do all the technical things, that's fine. But that doesn't correlate with success. This is exactly, in my book, this is why I point out, there's all this research about valedictorians and salutatorians who really don't do anything in their life, because when you're competent as a test taker and a good grade getter, that's fine, but it doesn't get you there. The people that thrive are people like you that trust their instincts and their EQ and take a risk and all that.
Well,
the others,
I was always bad at taking tests.
yeah. But it's great, Sarah. I mean, I remember when you came in, if I hadn't already written the book, I certainly would have had a big section on you, because you are the poster child for somebody who had a vision and did it. And it's, you write a book, you set up businesses, you're doing all this stuff. And I think competency is overrated. A lot of it is just jumping in the arena and trying to do stuff, and figuring it out along the way. But it takes a lot to, that is much more an EQ thing of figuring stuff out. Whereas the test takers, they're much more comfortable with metrics that are, they can count on. But it'll never equate to taking the big risks in the right moments,
So as you were writing this book, I'm sure you kind of scoured your brain for all the stories that you had thought about, and really those moments in your life that you were like, oh my gosh, look at this lesson that I learned from this, or those really pivotal moments. If you could tell us one story, what would it be?
I'll tell you one about culture and why corporate culture really matters, because I really believe in crunch time, whether it's political leadership or corporate leadership, the culture you've created and the principles that undergird it are really important. So when I was at State Department, I was getting ready to leave, and I was interviewing with certain investment banks. I didn't tell the guy that I was working with a lot, the number 2 guy at the State Department. His name is John Whitehead. He's a legendary chairman of Goldman Sachs. I didn't tell him I was interviewing with Goldman. Finally, I took a job with Goldman Sachs. I went into his office, this cavernous office in Foggy Bottom, sat down. I said, Secretary Whitehead, I need to tell you something. I'm leaving State Department to go to New York to work with a shabby investment bank you might have heard about, Goldman Sachs. And this is amazing, Sarah. What he did is he said, come with me. So we walked on the other side of his office, had me sit down in this little love seat, and he stood in front of me, opened the drawer, and read the 25 business principles that he wrote in 1954. He read them. It was kind of awkward. Read these things. They were the foundation of the culture of Goldman Sachs. And they weren't terribly well written. But they were real principles. And at the end, he looked at me and he said, Doug, the most important thing you can do while you're at Goldman Sachs is to remind the firm to live up to these principles. Mm. And I thought, well, there's a cultural moment. There's a person who shaped the Goldman Sachs culture until it went public, which that became a different animal, and they've been trying to get back on track again. And I think they're doing great now. But this culture was, nobody ever left, because the culture was, we're a team. All these individual superstars wouldn't fit there, because everything, you got compensated based on how you worked as a team. Everything was we. And it's very different than the way people think of Wall Street a lot of times. So that was a great moment. I've had so many that are amazing. I remember sitting with Lawrence Rockefeller on Fifth Avenue in his beautiful home having a bottle of Bordeaux with him one night. So I say to Lawrence, and this is in the book, I said, so Lawrence, what is it like to be a Rockefeller? I'm just curious. And he tells me this, and some of the stories I wasn't able to tell as long as the people were alive, but he's gone now. And he says to me, he says, I have this reoccurring nightmare that I'm at the bottom of a well. And I look up and my father and John D. Rockefeller are looking down on me with great disdain, and they won't help me get out, and I'm trapped. And he said, I'm trapped by expectations of being a Rockefeller and all that's expected of us and our wealth and our name and our position in society. And then he looked at me and he says, and I'd never heard this term before. He says, no one cries crocodile tears if you're a Rockefeller. But he said, we have problems too. So he was almost a cry to be taken as a human and not as a stereotypical billionaire family. He was very human at that point. So these stories, there's tons of stories in there that are, I say, so what's the difference between what I did in this book compared to David Brooks or Adam Grant or any of these people? I think they're all great. They're really smart. They're much smarter than I am. I think the difference with mine is it's like the Hamilton musical where Hamilton sings the song, I Just Want to Be in the Room.
I really hope you're going to rap for us right now.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And which, by the way, Stan Smith's wife knows every song. It's unbelievable.
I know every song too.
Oh, do you? Wow. That's impressive. That is impressive. But yeah, it's so interesting. These kind of things where you learn by these stories. And the reason I tell so many stories is because I think today people are learning more from stories because ingrained in the stories are truths. Because there's so many words out there, and people, do they believe them or not? But how does it work real time in your real life? That kind of thing. So that's why I tell a lot of stories, but use those to extract principles. And as I was saying, those guys are much better, but I feel like the Hamilton thing, I just want to be in the room. I feel like I've been in the room. So when I talk about something, it's born of the fact that I was at the White House working on policy. I was at the State Department negotiating stuff. Was at Goldman Sachs doing stuff. And that gives you a different eye as you look at things. It isn't theoretical, it's real.
Well, what's different about it?
What's different about it is you have to really refine these ideas in the crucible of real world stuff. So it's one thing to say, okay, here's 8 principles that I researched and they're terrific. It's another thing to say, I learned this principle about risk taking by taking risk, by doing stuff, by really, really testing each of these real time, in real ways.
I was listening to an old commencement speech recently by Ira Glass, who's the producer of This American Life. And he was talking about how when he tells stories, he's usually trying to get some big idea across, but when he tells stories, a lot of the times he uses like a very small story, and he gets people hooked with the small story and then introduces kind of a big idea. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the stories that I've heard from you over the years and in this book are sort of like that, where you get hooked and you get drawn in and
yeah. Because and part of why I use some of my celebrity friends a lot of times is because if a normal person reads this and say, well, if Steve Case or Peter Buffett or Lawrence Rockefeller or 50 other of these people struggle with, or am I enough? Maybe it's okay for me to start being honest about my own life. So part of that is to give people
a little bit. So, I mean, in your book, you talk about how too often successful people, they end up feeling empty and isolated and depressed. And
Yeah,
I'm sure that that's even increasing during this COVID time when everyone's isolated physically as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Tell me about what people can do.
Yeah, I think there are things they can do, but you're right. You're right, Sarah. The predicate for it is we are in a painfully um, lonely time in America. I mean, Dr. Vivek Murthy, the last Surgeon General, identified not obesity, not smoking, but loneliness is the major health epidemic of our age. And
I heard you say that at the Morgan Stanley Women's Conference.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I heard that, and
amazing.
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
I can believe it because I've done all these Gen Z interviews, and the teenagers today are the lonely generation for sure.
yeah. Well, it's even exacerbated more with them because they're creating all these fake personas that don't correlate with what they're really feeling a lot of times. So you have even greater distance from that. So if you recall in the class, what I try to do is say, the most attractive you is the authentic you. People are drawn to real people. And so that's the thing. For CEOs, there was an Inc. survey that came out a few years ago of 3,000 CEOs that were middle market and above were surveyed. Of the 3,000, half said that they were lonely and isolated. Of that half, 67% said they were making bad decisions because they had no one to trust. Now, if that was any other issue, people would say, "My gosh, that's if I'm on the board, that's a worrisome thing that our CEOs like that." So I think it is exacerbated by people with great positioning, a public persona, wealth. All those things just make the problem even more difficult. So what can you do to get to your question? I think this is why I'm a great advocate of small groups. I think we need people in our life that we can explore what really matters, who we dare to allow to know us in some fashion. So I think that's one thing you can do. I think the other thing is journaling, where you really reveal who you are, not the fake person that you want to project, but what are you really feeling? What do you care about? The other is just knowing, there's a whole social scientists actually call it the imposter syndrome. There is, with most people, leaders particularly, they feel like somebody's going to knock on the door of their office and say, you're not smart enough, you're not accompetent, you're out of here. It's none of us feel we deserve anything we've ever gotten. So I think, what does that all suggest? That all suggests we need not a lot of people, but a few in our life that really know us, warts and all, and accept us really as we are. And that frees us to be authentic with other people. But if you've never revealed yourself with one person or two, you're never going to talk openly with people in your office circumstance. I write in the book, on a practical level, one thing you can do in the workplace is, if you have a team or if a CEO has a senior management group, to bring them together once a week and take part of that time to allow them to tell their story. I promise you, people will be shocked and connected better with each other. So many times we misread each other because we see somebody that doesn't speak up and we say, well, they're judging me and all that. And really, they're just shy. But we misread them because we're ascribing to them things that we think we know, which we don't.
What advice would you give to, say, a young person with all these personas on social media, they're trying to show themselves in some authentic way on social, and they're struggling?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Well, I think the shaming culture doesn't help. So if somebody really would share, honestly, they might get put down or criticized or whatever. This is where I think you've got to have some real friends. This, unfortunately for them, the stats seem to indicate between 30 and 45, you start shedding friends because life kind of takes over. But that's where you have to really invest. But if you have a couple, then you don't put all this weight on there. If a couple of people really know you, it's like I used to say to people, I said, I'd be speaking someplace and I'd say, I hope you guys like me, but if you don't, that's okay. I've got a couple of people that I know that really do. And so, but if you have this insatiable need for everybody accept you and like you, you're going to, number one, you're not going to do anything in your life because you're going to be so afraid of offending somebody. And number two, what a worthless life to not live authentically you. I find that people are drawn to people that they're just who they are. And, that we've all made mistakes and all that. That's the thing with these scandals. It's almost like when they happen, if people instead of, I love the story of Abraham Lincoln in this regard, where one time he was in the equivalent of a press conference to the White House. This reporter said, "Mr. President, you are ridiculed and vilified in the press all the time that you aren't Eastern educated. You're gangly looking, skinny and tall and awkward. You aren't that articulate." They went on and on. They said, what do you think of that? How do you handle that? How do you get up every day? And he said something like this. He said, "I'm so much worse than they could ever know." And I thought of that so many times when I get all huffy and defensive when somebody criticizes. I said, I'm so much worse than they could ever know. Why in the hell am I defensive? It's so ridiculous. But that's why that's why Lincoln was so believable. He just let himself be known,
So as you go through different life stages, how do you apply the principles in your book differently?
That's a good question. I think my hope is that these are essential practices and principles are almost timeless. So you take risk-taking, for example. That might look differently in our life when you're younger. You might be all in, like you started some businesses and this COVID-19 thing has changed the environment. So you've got to pivot. Somebody that's 90 might not take that same risk, but we do know on their deathbed, one palliative nurse said the most frequent thing she heard of the elderly when they were dying was they wished they had taken more risks. So you take that and say, there are different seasons in your life, but risk needs to be a part of it because otherwise once you're playing a game to not get hurt, you're going to get hurt. So you shouldn't play the game of life to not get hurt. You need to keep trying things and pushing the envelope and going to new places. I have this video that I play at the class now. It's the world's oldest yoga teacher that we know about. I think she's 98. She's in Connecticut. Amazing. And she took up.
I've heard of her.
Yeah. She took up ballroom dancing at 87. And it isn't like she's tottering around. She is really doing this tango and all this stuff. It's like, oh my gosh, unbelievable.
Is she the same? She's the woman that wakes up every morning and she says, "This is going to be the best day of my life," right?
I think, yeah.
I feel like I've seen a video of her online. Telling people, "This is going to be the best day of your life." Tell yourself that every morning when you wake up.
It's and her whole argument. It's a mindset. It's the way you approach life. I mean, it's funny. This is where I juxtapose two ideas, Sarah. Difference between happiness and meaning. you'll appreciate the difference because you have 2 kids. I'll tell you this. Now, is being a mother happy all the time? No. But is it the most meaningful thing you've ever had experience in life? Probably yes. That's the same with this. So in a funny way, the people that are chasing happiness are always going to be disappointed because that's circumstantial. How my bank account's doing, how my relationship with my spouse is, my kids, oh, they're on drugs, I'm up and down. But you can have meaning under any circumstance. This is why one of my favorite books is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because he talks about in the death camps during World War II, it's not a happy environment. But if you had a meaning structure that transcended that place, you had a reason to still get up in the morning and live. So meaning is vitally important to feed. Happiness, not so much.
But meaning.
Yeah.
So meaning is what we should all be focused on.
Yeah.
How has your own story affected how you live your life?
I've always been kind of a non-conventional person, and which I kind of have enjoyed that. I've never had a plan really, and things just seems like they open up great opportunities all the time that I just am blown away by. And but I think it's because I'm alert to them, and wherever they seem to come from, I'm really curious about them, So I think for me, I've stayed curious. I've tried to keep exploring. I have a great line in here by Proust. The way I started out, he says, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. So I think the idea is constantly to be saying, how do I see things with new eyes? And I was on a call with NASDAQ today, interviewing 3 African Americans about this interesting moment we're in. And I said, for a lot of you that look like me that are on this call today, this is a really unsettling time. I urge you to do 2 things. One is listen, do a lot of listening right now. And 2 is try to see what's being said with new eyes. And don't try to come up with superficial solutions, which is our tendency. Just try to live into this moment. Try to see things that maybe you've missed. And maybe you'll make some changes.
Okay, I've got one more question, and it's about time management, my nemesis.
Yes.
So I'm like you, very curious person, and I'm constantly seeing opportunities and wanting to chase them. How do you distinguish which of those opportunities you should go after and which of the ones are actually going to lead to meaning and to success, and which ones are not worth your time?
Yeah, Callie, that's really hard. I think some of it is intuitive and gut driven. The other is this is related but different. I challenge the notion of a balanced life. I don't think it's possible with people that are curious and gifted. I think, though, there are seasons in life. When I was on the White House staff, if you left before 9 at night, they'd kid you and say you're working a half day. So it's like, but you don't live there. You don't work there for 50 years. You work there for 3. And so I think there are seasons when you're all in the same way there's seasons when you're just taking in ideas like crazy and you're trying some and rejecting others. And then there's times when you just say, okay, I'm going to be steady Eddie on this. So I say to people, take an idea and pursue it, but stamp a time on it. So let's say you and your spouse are going to, say, we're going to start this business. Okay, instead of every weekend when you're having a glass of wine, say, God, is this worth it? All that. No, I'd say do not have that conversation, but in 3 months have that conversation, because it'll drive you crazy otherwise. And things change. We don't we don't plant a tomato plant and pull it up every 2 days and say, how you doing? Just let it go, but then take a deep dive, whatever the time frame is, and say, okay, we've been deciding, should we live in New York? Let's not revisit it every night, because some days we hate it, some days we love it. Let's just be all in, but in 6 months, have that conversation. So I think a lot of it is managing, because when we start revisiting everything and our options again, it's usually when we're in a bad place. And we're saying, God, this isn't working and all that. Okay. So I'd say
Too much to think about.
yeah, pursue one or two of them and give it a time frame. And then say, if it isn't working, cut your losses. If you feel like there's enough promise there, but don't evaluate it all the time. It'll drive you crazy.
Yeah. I was reading this book, The One Thing.
Oh yeah.
And it starts out with a Russian proverb, and it says, if you chase two rabbits, you'll never catch one.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And optionality.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately.
Oh yeah, and you know, for those of us who are curious, if we're not careful, we can be spinning around and chasing everything. And that's where you have to, at some point, say, you know, this might not be perfect, but I'm gonna put my money down on this and take the risk. You know, that kind of thing.
All right, one more question. Tell me about your writing process. How did you get all the stories from your head into this book?
Well, you know, it's funny because I was teaching the course, I had it a little bit organized by different topics like risk taking. I'd put different articles, research and all over the years. And so I literally wrote the book in about a week. Because, you know, when I spent time in Oxford doing a degree, it's very rigorous, the writing. And I mean, they want you to be clear and simple. And so I like writing. I didn't before. I would write in typical academic jargon that really meant nothing, but it was flowery. And so I literally wrote the book in a week because I knew what I wanted to say. Now, that was like Michelangelo. He'd see a clump of granite and say, aha, I see a great sculpture in there. That's kind of was the beginning. So I'd start then chiseling away at it, adding, deleting, doing all that kind of stuff, you know.
That's very similar to my process, actually. My book was written in 2 weeks too. And everyone asks, how did you do that? And I'm like, well, I had it all in my head. I just had to brain dump it and get it all out. And then there was the editing process. But yeah. And the editing changes a lot. And, you know, as you know, Sarah, you don't know what you know until you write. I mean, it's really hard work to write, but it clarifies what you know and what you don't know. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you
for
your time today. Is there anything else you want to say or want to add?
No, I just think everybody's life will be changed if they read it. No, I'm just kidding.
I think so too. I mean, I have to say, I mean, before we get off the call, I mean, your course, which this book is based on, changed the course of my life. I realized that I was the kid like sitting at the top of the water slide, like too afraid to jump down. And I was at a big cushy corporate job and realized I had wanted to start a business for a very long time. And you know, I'd been doing a little bit on the side and not really wanted to jump in and do it full time, and ended up taking a risk and doing it.
Well, I teach that course. I wrote this book, all these things, because I'm trying to become the best version of me as possible. And I think, you know, if I had to sum everything up for people and they're going to listen to this or whatever, I'd say the best thing you can do for your family, your spouse, your kids, our world is become the best version of you that you possibly can. Because that is, the power is in who you are as a person. It isn't techniques. It's in who you are, you know.
Well, thank you so much, Doug, for being here today. And
thank you, Sarah. It's an honor.
Always really wonderful to speak with you.
Well,
I feel like I'm just soaking up knowledge. I feel like a sponge every time we talk.
No, I feel the same with you. You're amazing. You really are. I want to interview you next time.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.